to you about the legislative body in California. Can you tell us how this place works?
I can probably better tell you how it doesn't work. It's not we the people, it's we the government. And the greatest threat we have in America today is the people are losing their authority and power in the councils of government. Why? One is apathy of the American people. They just don't want to be bothered. Two is bureaucrats don't want to have the public involved either. Then they can push their agenda much more simply and with less accountability. The leaders pretty much control. They can control whether a bill gets brought up or not. They can control the outcome of the vote and how much information is provided to the members. And what is happening is Joe Citizen doesn't know what's going on, because even their elected representative who is here in the Capitol, they don't even know what they're voting on. They only got information about this within the last hour or even within the last few minutes. They don't know what's going on here. And unfortunately, that's by design, not by happenstance.
We want to talk to you about the legislative.
The Black Panthers, so this frightened the ruling elites, and they mounted a concerted and unfortunately exceedingly successful campaign to roll back that opening and close the or shut down or eradicate the programs that had addressed social inequality. Many of them put in place by the New Deal, but also by Lyndon Johnson's Great Society. And if you read the Lewis Powell memo, 1971, Powell was the attorney for the Chamber of Commerce, later was appointed to the Supreme Court. He really lays out how that assault will be carried out. That meant creating think tanks like the Heritage Foundation. It meant flooding money into the universities to essentially buy loyalty in political science departments, economic departments. It meant taking control of the airwaves. It meant using that money to demonize, marginalize, and push out of the mainstream critics of neoliberalism. I recommend very highly David Harvey's book, A Brief History of Neoliberalism. Neoliberalism never made any economic sense. It was based on the fringe elements of economic theorists, Hayek, and this kind of third-rate novelist, Ayn Rand, etc. But it made sense in terms of justifying the pillage by the ruling elites, which is all that really mattered. And people who didn't pay fealty to this neoliberal ideology were really ruthlessly silenced. I knew Sheldon Wolin. He died a few years ago, but certainly our most important contemporary political philosopher, taught at Berkeley, later at Princeton. And Wolin was shut out in the 80s from the New York Review of Books and all the other publications he used to write for, because he was calling neoliberalism out as a con. And so with the perpetuation of this ideology, the idea that if you deregulate the market, this will stimulate the economy, and there will be that kind of magical trickle-down effect, which of course is a myth. In fact, what it does is accrue political and economic power to that tiny oligarchic elite, which is of course where we are now. The 664 billionaires just during the pandemic alone saw their wealth increase by 44%. That's $1.3 trillion. So, all of those critics. Nader, of course, became a pariah. Nader was actually by name targeted within the Powell memo, and they gathered such force within both the social, cultural, and political establishment that in order to survive politically, you had to pay fealty to them, which is how you got a figure like Bill Clinton. Clinton, much like Tony Blair, Clinton transformed the Democratic Party into the Republican Party and pushed the Republican Party so far to the right it became insane. And he, with Biden was a major architect in the Senate at the time. He passed NAFTA, the greatest portrayal of the working class since the 1948 Taft-Hartley Act. He passed the 1994 Omnibus Crime Bill, which exploded the prison population. We had about 300,000 people incarcerated in 1970. We now have 2.3 million. Militarized the police. Glass-Steagall, which was a 1933 New Deal era piece of regulation that built a firewall, in essence, between commercial and investment banks. They ripped that down. That precipitated the global financial meltdown of 2008 and the banking crisis. And it's interesting, if you looked at Canada during that same period, they didn't have a banking crisis. Banks didn't close right and left because their version of Glass-Steagall had not been repealed. He deregulated the FCC, this is under Clinton, so that the airwaves are now controlled by about a half dozen corporations, Viacom, General Electric, Rupert Murdoch's News Corp, and that is about what 90% of most Americans listen to or watch. And so we essentially entered that era after the Clinton administration of what I would call the faux liberal. I write at length about this in my book, Death of the Liberal Class. Not that there isn't more pain among marginal communities, people of color in urban areas, but we have to remember that the two primary forms of social control in those areas are now so draconian and so fierce that it makes any kind of organized resistance almost impossible. What are those? Those are the police, militarized police, which now function as internal armies of occupation, and of course the system of mass incarceration. I teach in the New Jersey prison system through Rutgers in their college degree program, and most of my students, at least half of my students in those classes, wouldn't be there but for Clinton and Biden. The idea that you can be locked up for life for nonviolent crimes. 40% of the people in our prison system are never charged with physically harming another person. And most of them, 94% of them, never get jury trials. They're forced, coerced to plea out. And as Michelle Alexander has pointed out, if everybody went to demanded their right to a jury trial, the system would collapse. So you have people railroaded into the prison system. Enhancement laws, under terrorism laws, under Biden's 94 Omnibus Crime Bill, sentences are doubled, tripled, even quadrupled what they are in other countries. And so the mechanisms of police who have essentially stripped away any due process or habeas corpus, coupled with the prison system, has effectively shut down those communities. The white working class suffered, not to the same extent. But they have suffered through deindustrialization. And as Crane, Brinton, Jeffrey Davies, and other theorists of revolution have pointed out, those who rise up when you create societal rebellions do so primarily because their expectations are thwarted. It's interesting, Baldwin, I think you can't understand America if you don't read James Baldwin, but Baldwin at one point writes about why African American men in particular don't have the same kind of midlife crisis that white men have, and he said because black people very early on learned that the myth of America, of American exceptionalism, of meritocracy is a lie. But white men are more susceptible to it because up until recently they benefited from it through white supremacy. But all of that has been washed away. I was in Anderson, Indiana for my last book, America the Farewell Tour, with old UAW workers. Anderson used to be a center for GM, 25,000 union jobs, averaging about $25 an hour or more with benefits. All of that got taken away with NAFTA. The plants were not just shut down, they were actually bulldozed and destroyed. So they're weed-choked, gigantic compounds surrounded by cyclone fencing, and the city went into the usual death spiral that happens when those social bonds are ruptured. It is simplistic to blame a rise of a figure like Trump on racism or on Russia, which is absurd. Of course, the country that interferes most in our electoral process is not Russia, China, it's Israel. And that interference is so powerful that no administration can essentially challenge Israeli policy. Biden isn't going to move the embassy back to Tel Aviv from Jerusalem, even though that is a flagrant violation of international law. So
women's liberation, even women's sexual liberation, they were quite explicit about that, was a good thing, because women's sexuality and women's nature was seen as pure, and therefore it could never cause harms at the social level, whereas male sexuality was never seen as a good. It was often vilified and even pathologized as sick and destructive. Now, how that would work out in a situation of free love, I don't know, when one person's sexuality is seen as depraved and abusive and the other's is seen as good. So feminism always had that kind of fundamental contradiction. It wanted to free women, but it didn't really want to free men. And in fact, it wanted to control men even more rigorously than they were already controlled within the laws that governed marriage, in which male freedom was certainly not upheld. Men owed the women they married economic support for their entire lives, even if the woman left them. So there's always that contradiction. She doesn't say much about children. I think she also believed, along with people in the Oneida community and others, that children would be well enough off if they were raised by the community in general. And that the idea that a mother and father were the best people to raise a child in a traditional manner in a stable home, that was just a prejudice, and that children would be better off to be raised by a broad range of people in a loosely knit coalition of community members.
Well, I wonder, if she was raised on the road, in a way. Yes. I imagine that her upbringing was pretty loose, because she would have been part of a community, no doubt. Even though she was traveling with her mom and dad, I imagine that there was a whole troop of people that would be kind of a gypsy life, which
that's what I imagine too.
Right? So it kind of sounds like a gypsy idea.
Mm-hmm.
Although I haven't studied gypsies myself, I imagine that it is a fact that the childcare is distributed. I'm not against the child rearing being distributive, because I think it was good when we had multiple generations of families that lived together, and grandparents and aunts and uncles around, and so that you had. But there was always war, and you lost a lot of people, and so some of that was necessary to have more people around. But the idea was to make sure that the kids were taken care of, whereas this sounds like they were doing all they could to make sure that the kids were taken care of, but outside of what they were doing, like in the Oneida
yes.
communes, that they were taken away in the first form of daycare, in a way, that they were taken away and from the mothers and fathers, which would
just weeks old or
months
is that right?
Old. Wow.
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah. And I think it's part of a kind of communistic philosophy, and you find it in many communistic societies. It was practiced in the Soviet Union, certainly, and it was even practiced on some of the kibbutzes in Israel in the early years, when Israel was sort of more socialistic in its leanings. And I think, again, I wouldn't say I'm an expert on this, but I've certainly read about the results of it. And from all the reports I've read, it was disastrous, designed as part of this project to remake human nature, and as part of because it seems that in most communistic thinking, the family is distrusted at best, and the traditional family, and even hated at worst, and often seen as a site of oppression, especially oppression for women, but oppression for all members. And so the desire to destroy the family and to rear up a new generation of people who will not be molded by the family, and who in fact can be molded by a larger grouping, the state or the community, that is often fundamental to communist or socialist philosophy. And women's liberation, even women's sexual liberation, and they were quite explicit about that, was a good thing, because women's sexuality and women's nature was seen as pure, and therefore it could never cause harms at the social level. Whereas male sexuality was never seen as a good. It was often vilified and even pathologized as sick and destructive. Now, how that would work out in a situation of free love, I don't know. When one person's sexuality is seen as depraved and abusive, and the other's is seen as good. So feminism always had that kind of fundamental contradiction. It wanted to free women, but it didn't really want to free men. Quite disturbing about a lot of the advocacy of Elizabeth Cady Stanton and her allies was that they didn't actually come out and say it, but they were often much more sympathetic to women who committed various horrific crimes than to the children against whom those crimes were committed. So they publicly advocated often on behalf of women who were charged with killing their children. And infanticide was a huge issue in the 19th century, accounting for many, many deaths of children. And they were very sympathetic to the woman and often made the case that the woman was, pushed to her limits. It was because she was powerless. It was because she was abused, which it may well have been in many cases, that was the reason why she had killed her children. And their empathy for the children or their horror at what had been done to them, sometimes even in cases, I looked at one in one of my videos of a woman who poisoned her 3 children with rat poison over a period of a number of months. And the children were, one was a baby, one was 4 years old, and one was 9. They died in agony. And I mean, it was really horrific. And the woman, certainly knew enough about the wrongness of her crime to hide it from neighbors and others. And yet she also was a target of quite a bit of empathy by a number of feminist advocates who tried to have her found not guilty, and the definition of insanity so that it covered really anything a woman did while she felt under duress in relation to her children. It's inconceivable that they would have made the same arguments about a man, even a man under duress. But they did it just seems like once you begin down that path of seeing women as victims who don't have any agency and should be excused and supported, you can then almost, you can forgive nearly any horrific crime.
And with all of these collapses of competent social orders and political stabilities, you're exponentially going to only have a default into catastrophic problems throughout the entire system. They are, by definition, an infection. They're not going to change from their war strategies into something competent. Their existence is the war strategy. Their existence is the ends to a mean, as opposed to a means to an end. Their entire goal is the generation and standardization of the means, which is the war strategies and the collapsing of the various societies with their various insanities. At which point, this fundamental concept of the Confederacy as a wizard felon society will perpetually create these criminal exchanges, which will only injure everyone who participates in it. At which point, if you're going to react to one of them engaging in a secret or public threat against you, such as a KKK putting up a flaming cross in someone's yard in order to keep people away from them, damaging of property, general threats, these kinds of things, these coercions are compliance into a permanent state of a hell society, which by definition is suicidal. at which point your active supporting them for the use of criminal violence and your backing of their use of their terrorist coup is, in fact, a suicide bombing by functional definition.